The divorce papers didn't arrive in an envelope. They arrived on the kitchen counter, folded neatly beside a cup of cold coffee, with a single sticky note on top that read, "I'm done." Brenda stared at those two words for a long time, not because she didn't understand them, but because she had spent the last 3 years of her life trying to understand a man who could reduce everything they had built together into 2 words on a sticky note. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply picked up the note, folded it once, and placed it inside her pocket. Then she finished her coffee, grabbed her coat, and walked out the door. That was the last morning Brenda ever spent in that house. His name was Victor Ashworth, a man the world knew as one of the most talented dancers of his generation. A man whose every movement on stage made audiences hold their breath. A man who, behind closed doors, could not stand the fact that his wife was becoming someone greater than he ever imagined. Brenda Ashworth, formerly Brenda Cole, had dedicated her entire life to one thing: understanding the human mind. From the moment she was a teenager sitting in a library reading books about psychology, she knew that this was her purpose. Not fame, not money, not applause. Her purpose was to sit across from broken people and help them find their way back to themselves. And she was extraordinary at it. By the time she married Victor, Brenda had already built a reputation as one of the most compassionate and skilled psychologists in the country. Her patients came from all walks of life: soldiers dealing with trauma, teenagers struggling with depression, families torn apart by grief. She didn't just listen to them. She carried their pain with her, long after they left her office. She stayed late. She made phone calls at midnight. She showed up every single time, even when it cost her. Victor knew all of this when he married her. He saw it. He admired it at first. But admiration, as it often does, quietly turned into something else. Before we continue with this story, let us know in the comment section where you are watching from. And if you are new here, hit the like and subscribe button to get notified whenever we drop a video. Started small. Comment here. A sigh there. Victor would come home after a grueling rehearsal, drenched in sweat and exhausted, only to find that Brenda was still at work. Again. He would sit alone at the dinner table, eating cold food, scrolling through his phone, and the silence in that house would start to feel less like peace and more like punishment. "You said you'd be home by 7, he told her one evening, his voice flat. Brenda looked up from her laptop, guilt flickering across her face. "I know.
I'm sorry, Victor.
One of my patients, she had a breakdown today. I couldn't just leave her there." "You never can," Victor said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The disappointment in his tone was louder than any shout. Brenda closed her laptop. She walked over to him and sat beside him on the couch. She reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. Not aggressively, just slowly, deliberately. "Victor, please, talk to me." "What do you want me to say, Brenda?" He finally looked at her. "That I feel like I'm married to someone who is always somewhere else? That I come home every night and it feels like this house belongs to a ghost?" "That's not fair," she said quietly. "Maybe it's not," he replied, "but it's the truth." That conversation happened 6 months before the divorce papers appeared on the kitchen counter. In those 6 months, the distance between them grew like a crack in concrete. Slow, invisible, and impossible to stop once it started. Victor began spending more time with his dance partner, a woman named Elaine. Elaine was beautiful, effortless, and always available. She was everything Brenda wasn't in Victor's life at that moment. Present. Uncomplicated. Easy. Brenda noticed, of course. She wasn't blind. But she also wasn't the kind of woman who would chase someone who didn't want to be caught. She confronted Victor about it once, directly, with calm and clarity. "Are you seeing Elaine?" she asked him one night, standing in the doorway of his study. Victor didn't flinch.
No.
"She's my dance partner, Brenda. That's it." "Then why does she call you at 2 in the morning?" "Because we have an important performance coming up and she needed to go over choreography." Brenda studied his face for a long moment. She had spent her entire career reading people. Reading their micro-expressions, their body language, the things they tried to hide. And in that moment, She saw everything Victor was trying to conceal, but she said nothing more. Because sometimes the most devastating thing a person can do is simply choose to believe the lie, not out of ignorance, but out of exhaustion. Brenda was exhausted. Exhausted from trying to hold a marriage together while the other person was already letting go. 3 weeks later, the papers were on the counter, and Brenda walked out. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest of Brenda's life. She moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city. Nothing fancy, nothing grand. A couch, a bed, a bookshelf, and a view of the street below where she would sometimes sit in the early mornings, watching the world wake up while she tried to figure out how to rebuild her own. Her closest friend, a fellow psychologist named Dana, was the first person she told. Dana showed up at Brenda's door with 2 cups of tea and a look on her face that said she already knew everything before a single word was spoken. "He left," Brenda said, handing her a spare key. Dana didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't offer empty consolations. Instead, she sat down across from Brenda, handed her one of the cups and said, "How are you feeling? And don't give me the professional answer. Give me the real one." Brenda wrapped her hands around the warm cup and stared into it for a long time. "Relieved," she finally said, "and angry, and sad, all at the same time." "That makes sense," Dana said gently. "All of those things can exist together. I keep wondering if I could have done something differently," Brenda continued, her voice dropping. "If I had been home more, if I had paid more attention. Maybe." "Stop," Dana said firmly, but not unkindly. "Brenda, listen to me. You did not fail that marriage. You poured everything you had into it. The problem was never your dedication to your work. The problem was that Victor wanted a wife who would shrink herself to fit into his life. And you were never going to be that woman. And that's not a flaw. That's a strength." Brenda looked at her friend, and for the first time since she read that sticky note, her eyes filled with tears. Not because she was sad about losing Victor, but because someone had finally said out loud the thing she had been too afraid to admit to herself. She had been enough. She had always been enough. Victor had simply chosen not to see it. The months that followed became a turning point in Brenda's life. She threw herself back into her work with a renewed sense of purpose. Her patients noticed the shift in her, a quiet, unshakable confidence that hadn't been there before. She started publishing articles. She began speaking at conferences. And one day, after a long conversation with a colleague who worked with an international humanitarian organization, Brenda made a decision that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She applied to become a representative for Doctors Without Borders. The application process was grueling. Interviews, assessments, background checks, psychological evaluations. Brenda had to prove not only that she was qualified, but that she had the emotional resilience to do the work. And she did. She passed every single stage. When the letter arrived confirming her acceptance, Brenda read it alone, sitting on her small couch in her small apartment, with the morning light streaming through the window. She didn't celebrate. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat there, holding the letter in her hands, and felt something settle inside her chest. Something that felt a lot like peace. For the first time in years, Brenda Cole was exactly where she was supposed to be. Meanwhile, across the city, Victor Ashworth was building a world of his own. His dance career had skyrocketed. He was performing at sold-out venues, landing magazine covers, and becoming a household name. Elaine was by his side on every stage, their chemistry undeniable, their performances breathtaking. But at night, when the curtain came down and the applause faded and the cameras were turned off, Victor would sometimes find himself sitting in the dark, thinking about a woman who had once sat across from him on a couch and asked him, with genuine concern in her voice, "Talk to me." He never told anyone about those moments. He buried them deep, the way people bury things they are not yet ready to face. But the thing about buried feelings is that they have a way of surfacing when you least expect it. And Victor's moment was coming soon. The interview was supposed to be routine. Victor had done dozens of them before. Sit down, smile, answer a few questions about his upcoming show, thank the host and walk off stage. Simple, painless, a 15-minute obligation that came with the territory of being famous. But this one was different. This one was live. The show was called The Spotlight, one of the most watched entertainment programs in the country. Millions of people tuned in every Friday night to watch celebrities pour their hearts out on national television. The host, a sharp and charismatic woman named Margaret, had a gift for pulling things out of people that they never intended to reveal. Victor had been warned about this. His manager, a no-nonsense man named Greg, had pulled him aside before the taping and said, "Keep it clean, Victor. Answer the questions, smile, and don't let her get under your skin. The last thing you need is some emotional confession going viral." Victor had nodded. He understood the game. He had played it before. But that evening, something was different inside him. Something he couldn't quite name. A restlessness. A hollow ache that had been growing quietly in his chest for weeks, and that he had been ignoring the way you ignore a sound in the walls. Pretending it wasn't there, hoping it would stop on its own. It didn't stop. The studio lights were bright. The audience was buzzing with excitement. Elaine sat in the front row, watching him with that easy, warm smile she always wore. Victor waved to her as he took his seat across from Margaret. The cameras were rolling. Millions of eyes were watching. Margaret leaned forward, her expression soft but knowing. "Victor, you've had an incredible year. The sold-out tours, the awards, the magazine covers. It's been nothing short of extraordinary. So I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me and with our audience tonight." Victor smiled. He was good at smiling. "Of course." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What's the one thing you regret the most in your life?" The question landed differently than Victor expected. It wasn't a casual question. It wasn't something he could deflect with humor or a well-rehearsed answer about the pressures of fame. Margaret was looking at him with those calm, perceptive eyes, and the studio had gone quiet and millions of people were watching, and for some reason, a reason Victor himself could not explain, the walls he had built inside his mind began to crack. He opened his mouth to give the safe answer. Something about wishing he had started dancing earlier. Something about the sacrifices of the industry. Something that sounded deep but meant nothing. But the words that came out were not those words. "I regret not meeting Brenda sooner," he said. The studio went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The kind of silence that comes after someone has said something so raw, so unexpected, that the entire room needs a moment to process it. Margaret blinked. Even she hadn't seen that coming. "Brenda?" she repeated carefully. Victor's jaw tightened. He hadn't meant to say it. He knew that. The moment the name left his lips, a part of him wanted to take it back, to laugh it off, to steer the conversation somewhere safe. But another part of him, the deeper, quieter part, felt a strange, aching relief, as though the words had been sitting on his chest for months, and saying them out loud had finally let him breathe. "Yes," he said quietly. "Brenda." Margaret, sensing the weight of the moment, didn't push. She simply nodded and moved on to the next question. But the damage, or perhaps the truth, had already been spoken. In the front row, Elaine's smile had frozen on her face. And somewhere across the city, Brenda Cole was sitting in her apartment, a cup of tea growing cold beside her, completely unaware that the man who had once handed her a sticky note with 2 words on it had just handed the entire country a confession she never asked for. The next morning, Brenda woke up to 47 missed calls. She stared at her phone, confused. She didn't recognize most of the numbers. She scrolled through the notifications and saw message after message, all saying variations of the same thing. "Have you seen the news? And call me as soon as you can, and Brenda, turn on the TV." She called Dana first. Dana answered on the first ring, her voice tight with a mix of concern and something that sounded dangerously close to vindication. "Please tell me you haven't seen it yet." "Seen what?" Brenda asked, sitting up in bed, already feeling a knot forming in her stomach. "Victor, on the spotlight, last night."
Dana paused.
"He talked about you, Brenda, on live television, in front of millions of people." Brenda's hand tightened around her phone. "What did he say?" "He said he regrets not meeting you sooner." The line went quiet for a long moment. Brenda stared at the wall across from her bed, processing those words. Regrets not meeting me sooner. The same man who had left her a sticky note that said, I'm done. The same man who had pulled his hand away when she reached for him on the couch. The same man who had looked her in the eye and lied about Elaine. That man had just sat on national television and told the world he wished he had more time with her. Brenda. Dana's voice came through, gentle but firm. Are you okay? I don't know yet, Brenda said honestly. I genuinely don't know. She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. The morning light crept across the floor of her apartment, slow and indifferent to the storm happening inside her mind. She thought about calling Victor. She thought about sending him a message. She thought about all the things she could say to him. The anger, the hurt, the questions that had kept her awake on so many nights in this very apartment. But then she thought about something else. She thought about the woman she had become in the months since that sticky note. The woman who had walked into Doctors Without Borders and earned the respect of people who had seen the worst of the world. The woman who sat with refugees and trauma survivors and held space for their pain without flinching. The woman who had rebuilt herself, quietly and deliberately, without asking anyone for permission or validation. And she decided, right there in that moment, that Victor's confession was not her story to carry. It was his burden, his regret, his mess. Hers was a life she had built with her own hands. The decision to do her own interview came 2 weeks later, and it was not planned. It was not strategic. It simply happened the way some of the most important things in life do, organically without fanfare in the middle of an ordinary day. Brenda had been invited to speak at a press event for Doctors Without Borders. The organization was launching a new mental health initiative in underserved communities, and Brenda, as one of their most visible representatives, was asked to be part of the media panel. She agreed without hesitation. This was her work. This was what mattered to her. The press conference was held in a sleek, modern building downtown. Journalists from half a dozen outlets were in attendance. Cameras lined the back of the room. Brenda sat at a long table beside 2 other representatives, a microphone in front of her, and a room full of strangers watching her every move. The first few questions were easy. What does the organization do? How does this new initiative work? What communities will benefit? Brenda answered each one with clarity and warmth, the way she answered everything, with genuine care for the people she was talking about. But then one journalist, a young man with sharp eyes and a recorder already running, raised his hand and asked the question that changed everything. Brenda, I heard that your husband divorced you because of your career. Is that true? And if so, do you regret it? The room shifted. Every head turned toward her. The other representatives at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone in the back of the room coughed. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant, pressing against Brenda from every direction. She could have deflected. She could have smiled politely and said she preferred not to discuss her personal life. She could have redirected the conversation back to the work, back to the mission, back to anything that wasn't the open wound of her failed marriage. But Brenda didn't flinch. She leaned forward, just slightly, and looked directly at the journalist. And then she looked past him into the camera that was recording everything, and she said the words that would echo across the internet for weeks. I don't regret the divorce. Her voice was steady, calm, not defiant, not bitter, just honest. The kind of honest that comes from a place of absolute peace. The journalist blinked. He had not expected that answer. No one in the room had. Not at all, he pressed. Not at all, Brenda repeated. It gave me the freedom to become who I was always meant to be. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then turned back to the moderator and nodded, signaling that she was done with that question. The room erupted into a quiet murmur. Cameras clicked and whirred. Someone in the back was already typing furiously on their phone. And somewhere across the city, on a screen in a green room backstage at a dance rehearsal, a clip of Brenda's words was about to start playing on loop. Victor had no idea what was coming. Victor saw it on a Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting in the green room backstage at the rehearsal studio, still in his practice clothes, scrolling mindlessly through his phone while waiting for his next session. Elaine had just stepped out to grab water. The room was quiet. the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing feel loud. Greg, his manager, was the one who sent the link. No message, no context, just a URL and 3 dots at the end, the way people text when they want you to figure out for yourself how bad something is. Victor clicked on it. The video was 43 seconds long. It was a clip from a press conference, clean footage, well lit, the kind that spreads fast because it looks professional enough to be credible. And in the center of the frame, sitting at a long table with a microphone in front of her, was Brenda. She looked different. Not in the way that time changes people, a little older, a little softer around the edges. She looked different in the way that someone looks when they have stopped carrying weight they were never meant to carry. Her posture was straight. Her eyes were clear. And when the journalist asked her about the divorce, she didn't hesitate for even a single second. I don't regret the divorce. Victor watched the clip once. Then he watched it again. And then a third time, replaying those 5 words on a loop, each repetition landing heavier than the last. He put his phone down and stared at the wall across from him. The thing that cut him the deepest was not the words themselves. It was the tone, the absolute, unshakable calm in her voice. There was no anger in it. No bitterness. No residual pain. Just clarity. Just peace. Brenda had said those words the way someone states a fact. The sky is blue.
Water is wet.
I do not regret losing you. And that, more than anything Victor had ever felt in his life, terrified him. Elaine walked back into the green room with 2 bottles of water, her smile already forming on her lips. It died the moment she saw his face. Victor? What happened? He handed her his phone without a word. She took it, watched the clip, and handed it back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. So, Elaine said carefully, sitting down beside him, that's Brenda. Yes. Your ex-wife. Yes. Elaine studied him for a moment. She was perceptive, one of the things Victor had always appreciated about her. She could read a room the way dancers read music, instinctively and completely. You still love her, Elaine said. It wasn't a question. Victor didn't answer, which was in itself an answer. Elaine nodded slowly. She didn't look angry. She didn't look hurt. She looked like someone who had always suspected this moment would come, and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. You should go talk to her, Elaine said quietly. She won't want to hear from me, Victor replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Probably not, Elaine agreed. But you need to try. For yourself, if nothing else. By that evening, the internet had done what the internet does best. It took a 43-second clip and turned it into a war. Within hours, the video had been viewed over 2 million times. Clips of Brenda's interview were being stitched together with clips of Victor's confession on the spotlight from 2 weeks earlier. Side by side, her words and his words, playing one after the other, a collision of 2 people's truths laid bare for the entire world to judge. The comments were brutal. Not toward Brenda, toward Victor. He divorced her and then went on TV crying about it? She's the most unbothered woman alive and I am here for it. Victor really said, I regret not meeting her sooner, and she said, I don't regret the divorce. The contrast is actually insane. Brenda Cole is an icon. Someone protect this woman. Hashtags started trending. Hashtag Brenda Cole. Hashtag no regrets. Hashtag the real Victor. People who had never heard of either of them were now firmly picking sides, and the side they were picking was overwhelmingly, decisively Brenda's. Dana called Brenda that night breathless. Have you been online at all today? Dana asked without preamble. No, Brenda said. She was in her apartment, curled up on the couch with a book she had been meaning to finish for weeks. The window behind her was dark. The city hummed quietly below. Brenda, you are trending. Nationally, people are calling you an icon. Brenda blinked. An icon? For what? For being unbothered, Dana said, and Brenda could hear the grin in her voice. Someone put your interview next to Victor's confession and it's everywhere. People are losing their minds over it. Brenda was quiet for a moment. She thought about the press conference. She thought about the journalist with the sharp eyes and the recorder. She thought about the way the room had shifted when she gave her answer. And then she thought about Victor, sitting somewhere on the other side of the city, watching the same videos, reading the same comments, finally confronting the full weight of what he had done and what he had lost. Good, Brenda said simply, not with cruelty, not with satisfaction, just with a quiet, settled finality. Good, she repeated and turned the page of her book. Victor tried to reach her 3 days later. He didn't call. He knew better than that. Instead, he showed up at the building where Doctors Without Borders had their local office, armed with nothing but a single white envelope and the fragile hope that she might be willing to hear him out. He found out from the receptionist, a kind, middle-aged woman who looked at him with polite suspicion, that Brenda was not in the office that day. "Can I leave this for her?" Victor asked, holding up the envelope. The woman looked at the envelope, then at Victor, then back at the envelope. She took it without a word and placed it on the desk beside her. Victor stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as though waiting for something. A sign, a feeling, some confirmation that this gesture meant anything at all. But the lobby was quiet and indifferent, and no sign came, so he turned and walked back out into the cold. Brenda found the envelope the next morning. She opened it at her desk, before the first meeting of the day, while the office was still waking up around her. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, written in Victor's handwriting. Sharp, slightly uneven, the way it always was when he was writing fast, when he was writing from somewhere urgent inside himself. The letter was short, only a few lines. "Brenda, I know I don't have the right to ask for your time or your attention. I know I gave that up a long time ago, but I need you to know that I see what I did. I see who you are, and I am sorry. Not for the divorce, because that was the door you needed to walk through. I'm sorry for everything that led to it. I'm sorry I made you feel like your greatness was inconvenient. You were never inconvenient. You were the most important thing in my life, and I was too blind and too selfish to see it until you were gone. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know." Brenda read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it down on her desk. She sat there for a long time, staring at it, feeling the weight of his words settle over her the way a heavy blanket settles. Not painful, but heavy, present. She thought about calling him. She thought about writing back. She thought about all the versions of the story where Brenda and Victor find their way back to each other, where the regret becomes reconciliation, where the love that was buried under resentment and distance and pride finally gets its second chance. She thought about all of those versions. And then she let them go. Not because she didn't feel anything. She did. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the layers of healing and growth and quiet strength she had built over the past year, there was still a part of her that remembered what it felt like to love Victor Ashworth. That part of her would probably never fully disappear. But Brenda had learned something in the months since that sticky note. She had learned that love is not enough to build a life on. You need trust. You need respect. You need someone who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses to stay not because it is easy, but because you are worth the difficulty. Victor had not been that person. And no letter, no matter how sincere, could retroactively make him one. Brenda picked up the envelope one last time. She held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the paper, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Then she opened her desk drawer, placed it inside, and closed it. She didn't throw it away. That would have been dramatic. That would have been a statement. This was quieter than that. This was simply moving on. The weeks that followed were strange for Victor. Not painful in the way he expected. Not loud. There was no public scandal. No dramatic confrontation. No moment where someone cornered him on camera and forced him to explain himself. The world didn't come crashing down around him. It simply shifted. Quietly. Irreversibly. His manager, Greg, called him the morning after Brenda's interview went viral. The call lasted 11 minutes. Greg didn't shout. He didn't lecture. He simply laid out the reality in the same flat, clinical tone he used for everything. The narrative has changed, Victor. People aren't seeing you as the charming dancer anymore. They're seeing you as the man who threw away the most impressive woman in the room. And that's a hard thing to come back from. Victor listened without saying a word. I'm not saying your career is over. Greg continued. I'm saying you need to be careful. Every interview from here on out is going to circle back to this. Every red carpet, every event. You are going to be asked about Brenda Cole for the rest of your professional life. You need to be ready for that. Victor hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. He thought about responding to the internet. He thought about making a statement. Something public, something that would set the record straight. Something that would remind the world that marriages are complicated and that the story people saw in those 43 seconds was not the whole truth. But then he stopped himself. Because the truth was, it was the story people saw. A woman who had been let down by a man who couldn't handle her greatness, and who had risen above it with grace and dignity. That story was true. It was the truest thing that had ever been told about the both of them. And Victor knew, in the quiet and honest part of himself that he rarely visited, that he had no right to rewrite it. So he said nothing. He went back to rehearsals. He performed his shows. He smiled for the cameras. And when the interviewers asked him about Brenda, and they always asked, he gave the same answer every time, calm and without deflection. She is an extraordinary woman. I have nothing but admiration and respect for her. And I wish her every happiness. It was not the dramatic, tearful confession people were hoping for. It was not the groveling apology the internet demanded. It was simply the truth, spoken quietly, by a man who was finally learning that some debts cannot be paid with words. Meanwhile, Brenda's life continued to unfold in ways that had nothing to do with Victor and everything to do with herself. The attention from the viral moment brought unexpected opportunities. Brenda was invited to speak at a mental health summit in Geneva. She was approached by a publishing house interested in a book about her work with trauma survivors. A documentary crew reached out, wanting to follow her on her next assignment with Doctors Without Borders, a 6-week trip to a rural community in East Africa, where she would be setting up a mobile counseling center for women and children affected by conflict. She said yes to all of it, not because she was chasing fame, not because the world was suddenly watching, but because these were the doors that her work had opened, and Brenda had spent too many years of her life shrinking herself to walk through them. Dana was with her the night before she left for Africa. They were sitting on the floor of Brenda's apartment, surrounded by half-packed suitcases and the quiet chaos of someone preparing to leave the country. There were 2 glasses of wine on the coffee table, both barely touched. "Are you nervous?" Dana asked. Brenda considered the question. "A little," she admitted. "Not about the work. About being gone. About being alone in a place where I don't know anyone." "You've been alone before," Dana pointed out gently. "You survived it." "I did," Brenda said. "But this feels different. This isn't surviving. This is choosing." Dana smiled at that. "That's growth, Brenda. That's what it actually looks like." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the way only people who have known each other for years can sit, without the need to fill the space, without the pressure to perform. The city hummed outside the window. Somewhere far below, a car horn blared and faded. "Do you ever think about him?" Dana asked after a while. Not unkindly, just curious. Brenda was quiet for a moment. She turned her wine glass slowly in her hand, watching the way the light caught the surface of the liquid. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Not with anger. Not even with sadness, really. More like acknowledgement. He was a part of my story. An important part. He taught me things about myself that I needed to learn." "What did he teach you?" Brenda thought about it carefully before she answered. "He taught me where my boundaries are. He taught me what I will and won't accept. He taught me that the people who are supposed to love you don't always do it well. And he taught me that I am capable of surviving even when someone I trusted completely lets me down." She paused, and then a small, quiet smile crossed her face. "Most importantly, he taught me that my worth is not determined by whether someone chooses to stay." Dana raised her glass. "To that," she said. Brenda raised hers. They touched glasses softly, and the sound was small and unhurried, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The morning Brenda left for Africa, she woke up before the alarm. The apartment was dark and still. She lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her own breathing, feeling the strange and unfamiliar lightness in her chest that had become a permanent part of her over the past year. She thought about the woman she had been 12 months ago, the woman who had stood in a kitchen, reading 2 words on a sticky note, and had quietly folded them into her pocket without a single tear. That woman had been strong, but she had also been carrying something heavy, the weight of a marriage that had slowly been draining her, the quiet grief of loving someone who didn't see her, the exhaustion of being the only one trying to hold things together. That woman was gone now, not erased, not forgotten, simply transformed. The woman who lay in that bed on that quiet morning was someone new, someone who had walked through the hardest door of her life and come out the other side not just intact, but luminous. Someone who had looked the world in the eye on national television and said, without hesitation, that she did not regret a single thing. Someone who was free. She got out of bed, showered, dressed, and packed the last of her things into her carry-on bag. She moved through the apartment with calm efficiency, turning off lights, checking locks, making sure everything was in order. Before she left, she paused at the door and turned back to look at the space one last time. It was a small apartment, nothing special. A couch, a bed, a bookshelf, and a view of the street. But it was the place where she had put herself back together, piece by piece, quietly, without anyone watching. And she felt a deep, wordless gratitude toward it, toward herself, for surviving it. Then she turned off the light, stepped out, and closed the door behind her. On the flight to Geneva, where she would connect to Nairobi, Brenda sat by the window and watched the clouds pass beneath her. The cabin was dim. Most of the passengers were asleep. The hum of the engine was steady and hypnotic, and Brenda let it wash over her, feeling the distance grow between herself and the city she was leaving behind. She did not think about Victor. She did not think about the viral videos or the trending hashtags or the letters in desk drawers. She thought about the women and children she was flying toward. She thought about the counseling center she was about to help build. She thought about the conversations she would have in the weeks ahead, the raw, honest, difficult conversations that were the reason she had become a psychologist in the first place. She thought about purpose, about the quiet, steady, unshakable feeling of knowing exactly who you are and exactly where you are going. And she smiled. Not for anyone, not for a camera, not for the internet or the world or the man who had once left 2 words on a sticky note and called it the end of everything. She smiled for herself, because for the first time in her life, Brenda Cole was not running from something. She was running toward it, and nothing, not regret, not love, not the ghost of a marriage that had already been buried, was ever going to slow her down again. That was the end of Brenda's story, or rather, it was the beginning of the next chapter. One that belonged entirely to her, written in her own hand, on her own terms, in her own time. And if there is one thing this story can teach us, it is this: the people who walk away from you quietly are not always the ones who lost. Sometimes they are the ones who finally found themselves. If the story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then let us know. Drop a comment below and tell us the moment in this story that hit you the hardest. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one coming, and you do not want to miss a single one. Like this video, subscribe to Urban Folks TV channel, and turn on your notifications. Until next time, take care of yourself. You are worth more than you know.